Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today for the Housing Specialist Certification Program Decision Makers Overview. My name is Erica Alfaro. I am the SEBA Advisor for Housing here at APLA Health and Wellness, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. So before we proceed with the webinar, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items for those of you who are new to using Zoom. First, I do recommend that all participants minimize their screen. All you should see right now is the presentation slide. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of the presentation, you'll see a ribbon with various widgets. You have the widget for audio. This will give you the call-in information if you need to access audio over the phone, or you can use your computer audio as well. Everyone's line will be muted for the duration of this webinar. I also encourage you all to ask questions during the webinar. You will see a widget for the chat box. When you click that widget, you'll see a chat box appear on the right-hand side. Again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in that box, and I will answer them either throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar. This webinar will also be recorded, so it will be posted on the Housing Specialist Certification website, and once that becomes available, I will email you all. So if you need to reference this webinar again, you will have it available. So I'll try to have it by mid next week. So I would like to acknowledge the Los Angeles Housing Community and Investment Department, who have given us the opportunity to develop and successfully deliver the Housing Specialist Certification Training Program, which helps to increase the capacity of housing specialists in LA County to provide quality housing services. And I'd also like to acknowledge APLA Health for developing and implementing the Housing Specialist Certification Training Program, supportive workshops, and webinars for housing specialists. So these are the individuals involved in the Housing Specialist Certification Program. So that would be Jeff Bailey, who's the Director of HIV Access, and myself, Erica Alfaro, who is the Capacity Building Assistance Advisor for Housing here at APLA. So some of the slides that you will see here will be reviewed for a lot of you, but we do have new program managers on staff, and it's important for me to go over this information so that everyone is on the same page. So thank you for seeing these slides again, for those of you who have already seen them. So I want to start off by going over how the certification program came about. So the Housing Specialist Certification Program was proposed based on the years' experience that APLA has or has had in providing housing services in LA County. So all of you know Bill Brown. He is the program manager for housing supportive services here at APLA, and he's been able to implement a very successful model in terms of providing housing services in a more holistic manner to ensure housing stability of the clients that their housing specialists work with. In addition, APLA had been providing capacity building at a national level for over 12 years, and through that experience, the department was able to successfully develop a capacity building framework, which I'll go over later on in this presentation, as well as develop resources to build the capacity of HIV prevention and HIV service providers that the department saw were also applicable to the work done by housing specialists. We have found that the Housing Specialist Certification Program is one of the first, if not the first, certification of its kind nationally. I was able to actually do a presentation at USCA last year where I talked a little bit about the model, and I had different housing program managers from different states nationally asked me a little bit more information about the model. So I'll be going over the model in this presentation for those of you who haven't seen it. Some of you who have participated in the training, of course, have gone over the content that housing specialists go through during the training, but you've also seen the housing services model, but I will present it here today. The certification program goes over a formal housing services model to standardize the provision of housing services throughout LA County. And this model lays out the framework and steps from initial contact with the client all the way to reaching housing stability, or once they've reached housing. The certification program focuses on the skills and competencies that housing specialists will need to engage and retain their clients in housing services. And these opportunities open the door to not only enhance the skills that housing specialists have, but also enhance the quality of services we provide to the communities that we work with. Long term, we hope that our clients can successfully obtain housing and increase their self-sufficiency while improving their health outcomes. So the benefits of the certification training program are that it creates a baseline of understanding of the core skills that are needed to provide housing services to the clients that we work with. And we know that a lot of the clients that we do work with come with many needs, and sometimes housing specialists need to know what their limits are in terms of providing services to them, but also making the appropriate referrals. And from there, we see the second bullet point, which is where housing specialists learn the roles and responsibilities that they have when they work with their clients or working with the HOPWell program. And finally, the certification program provides consistency in service delivery. This means that if we have a client who is seeking housing services in spot 2, but then decides to move to spot 8, then the messaging should be consistent throughout all the agencies funded by HCI-DLA, but also who have participated in this training program. So I want to go over the flow chart or the steps of going through the housing specialist training and receiving the certification, and also keeping the certification valid. So the first step that we see here is eligible participants, and these are the funded agencies, or the HCID funded agencies, who are the eligible participants for this certification training. So once HCID has identified those agencies, they provide APLA, or they provide me with the contact information, and then I reach out to them, and all of those agencies then participate in an orientation, which is actually the decision makers overview, which you're participating today. Once the agencies or the decision makers have participated in this webinar, then I begin the first step of the registration process for housing specialists, which is the letter of agreement. So for some of you, I've already begun to send out the letters of agreement, and some of you have already submitted them to me for those who will be participating in the next training. So once I get all the letters of agreement, I send out the registration link for the program. And that just is an extra step to for me to see that the housing specialist will actually participate in the training. As I've had housing specialists in the past who will submit a letter, but something comes up, or sometimes they have an appointment and they won't be able to participate in phase 1. And so that's why I send out that registration once I get the letter, is to see that they will be participating in the cohort. So once everyone's participated, I send everyone a link to the online pre-course, which is phase 1. And the phase 1 has 5 modules, and each module has assessments. So those assessments, it is required that housing specialists achieve a score of an 80% or above in order to be invited in the in-person training, or the 3-day in-person training. If they don't score an 80% or above, then they do not get invited to the in-person training, and they would have to wait until the next training becomes available. So for those who do pass, we see that they move on to the in-person training. And in the in-person training, I do provide a pre and a post test. And so for housing specialists to receive the certification, they're required to achieve an 80% or above in the post test. So the pre-test helps to see where they're at, like what they already know, and the post-test helps us determine if they were able to learn the information from the training. So we also see after the housing specialist certificate, we have the supplemental workshops and the webinar. So for housing specialists to keep their certification valid, they are required to either participate in one supplemental workshop or one webinar. They don't have to do a supplemental workshop and the webinar, they can do one or the other. And I'll talk about what the supplemental workshops and webinars are in just a few minutes, and I will talk to you about the dates that those will be available. So now I quickly want to talk about the approach. This is the housing services model, which some of you have already seen if you've participated in the training. For some of you, it may be the first time seeing it. So I want to very briefly go over the steps of the model for everyone to be on the same page. So we see that the first step is recruitment and initial contact. This is where the housing specialist provides information and educates the client about Hopla Housing Services, but we also see that it's where we begin to screen the client to see if they're eligible for to participate in the Hopla program. The second step is focused on building the relationship with the client. This is where we see the housing specialist will begin to build rapport with the client. They'll talk about the expectations and agreements, and they'll also identify any barriers that the client may have in terms of working with the housing specialist and being able to solve what those barriers are. So we're very specific in the training to let people know that for step 2, engagement in housing services, that it's identifying the barriers to working with the housing specialist and not the barriers to housing. The barriers to housing is in step 3. That's where they begin to identify what those barriers are, because that's where they begin to do the intake and the housing assessment. They identify the barriers, they develop a housing plan to address those barriers, and then we see at the end, we have support implementation plan. So it's throughout the time that the housing specialist is working with the client, they'll be supporting or providing support to the client to be able to meet those objectives that they've developed in the housing plan. Now, this step does have a little arrow that goes back to assess barriers. And what we talk about in the training is that we know that clients may not disclose everything, or sometimes things change, something may come up, and so we may have to go back to reassess those barriers or assess those new barriers and add them into the housing plan. And so obviously with the housing services model, I do want to point out that it's not time-based. Right, we know that for some clients, housing specialists may work with them for quite some time, and then we may have other clients who the housing specialist may not have to work with them for a long time. And then finally, we see step 4, which is closing the case. From the implementation perspective, we discuss the final assessment, which is looking closely to see if 2 goals were met. And those 2 goals are housing stability and self-sufficiency. When we look at self-sufficiency, we're looking to see if the client can identify barriers, plan to resolve those barriers, and implement a plan to resolving them while being able to access resources necessary to support their plan. And then we also discuss what closing the case can potentially look like and the different circumstances in which a case would be closed. Now, each agency may already have directives from their funder in terms of when the case will be closed. And so when we go over the case closure in this training, usually what I do is I like to ask, why would you close a case? And that's where everyone shares what their experiences have been, but they also talk about what their agency does in terms of closing the case. I call them 3 times, or I send them a letter. And so for each agency, that may look different. And so this training doesn't say, this is how you're supposed to do it in closing the case, but more of from the implementation component, from recruitment all the way to, let's say if the client does achieve housing, what would closing the case look like, right? We want to develop a plan. We want to ensure that the client remains self-sufficient, can still access services, right? Can be able to identify any barriers that may come up when it comes to something that can potentially put them at risk to become unstably housed again. And so that's just something that I want to point out when we talk about closing the cases. We do consider that each agency may have steps or protocols that may not be the same for all the agencies. And so now I want to move into the housing specialist training program and what each phase consists of. And I've already briefly talked about it when we looked at the flow chart, but here I want to also talk about the mixed methods approach that we use when it comes to the training program. So phase 1 is Housing Specialist 101 online pre-course. Again, this is the online course. This is where participants are given 1 week to complete the modules. There are 5 modules in the online course. It is self-paced. They can take the assessments as many times as they want to be able to achieve the 80%. And as I mentioned, everyone is given a week, and it is important as decision makers to inform staff of the time commitment that phase 1 requires, as I will no longer be giving extensions for phase 1. In the past, there have been some staff who have been unable to complete all the modules on the last day of phase 1 that I provide, and so I've had some reach out to me and say if they can get an extension. Moving forward, I will not be able to provide that, as staff are given sufficient time or reminders of this phase. And so as decision makers, it's really important to support staff with phase 1 and also checking in to see if they've been able to complete the modules. So I just want to make that brief announcement when it comes to phase 1. I will no longer be given extensions to staff, and I will also, for those who will be participating in this next workshop, I will also let them know that that will not be happening. And then phase 2 is the in-person training, and this is focused on building housing specialist skills and competencies around the provision of housing services. And there is a pre and post test, as I mentioned. And a passing score of an 80% is required to successfully complete the certification training program. If a participant does not achieve an 80% in the post-test, in the 3-day training, they will be invited to participate in the next face-to-face training. So they will not be required to do phase 1, but they would be required to do phase 2 again. What questions do you have in terms of the phase 1 and phase 2 or any of the assessments? You can go ahead and type them in the chat box. Okay, so I will go ahead and move forward, and if a question does come in, I'll make sure to answer it either at the end of the webinar or during when it comes up. So now Brandon, on average, how long does phase 1 take? So phase 1 is participants are given a week. I've had participants who finish in 1 day. I've had others that take the whole week. So it really depends on the housing specialist and how they manage their time when it comes to completing the online course. So, I mean, it's been a mixture of what I've noticed. So now that I've gone over the housing specialist certification training in terms of phase 1 and phase 2, and you've gotten a glimpse of the housing services model, I want to share with you some of the data that I've been able to gather from the trainings that we've conducted. So the first pilot of this training was conducted in 2017. And since then, we facilitated 10 online courses and 10 face-to-face trainings. We've had over 90 housing specialists complete this certification training program. And this number reflects program managers, directors, and also staff who have already left the agency or maybe have moved on from the HOPWA program. So just a heads up that that 98 is reflective of everyone who's done this training since the first pilot. So we use various tools to collect information and analyze the results. So these tools include the online pre-course assessments and in-person training and pre and post tests, which I've already talked about. And we do a training evaluation form. So this is given to participants on the last day of the training. And this is to measure their satisfaction of the training overall, the content, the facilitators, the activities. I'll go over some of that data as well. We also conduct a Delta Plus activity. The Delta Plus activity is usually conducted on the last day of the training as well. And usually facilitators step out and we have other people come in to conduct the activity. And this is just to gather more of the what participants felt overall about the workshop or about the training, what they enjoyed, what they wish could have been done differently, you know, what they enjoyed maybe about the facilitators or the activity. So this is just to get more information from them. And we ask the facilitators to step out because we want the participants to be able to share freely, right? We don't want them to feel like they have to hold anything back. And so that's the beauty of this Delta Plus activity. We also conduct a 3-month follow-up. And this is where we contact housing specialists or program coordinators or program managers who have completed the training. And this follow-up is to determine if the skills and competencies from the training are being utilized. So what we did, it was probably the beginning of this year, we had our intern at the time that she interned with us, she called a few of the housing specialists, and we've also reached out to a few managers about if the training and if they're utilizing the skills from the training, and also maybe what challenges they have encountered when implementing the skills that were delivered in the workshop. And so this is some of the results from all 10 trainings. So this is accumulating all of them. And they're really good results. I'm very pleased with the results that we've been able to gather from the trainings. This is from the training satisfaction form or the training evaluation form. We can see that the overall training, the content and the facilitation, over 90% of participants felt that it was either very good or good. So again, I'm very pleased with this, and I wanted to share it with all of you so that you can see the outcome of the training, right? Because you all send your staff to this 3-day training. It's having your staff step away from work and seeing clients to participate in this training. And so I wanted to share with you that we've had really positive outcomes. So this is some of the training feedback that we've been able to collect. We do collect that qualitative data as well to be able to support all the numbers that we collect. I won't be going over these quotes, but seeing some of the comments, we can see that it has elements of the training overall, of the content, of the activities, and facilitation. And again, I am recording this webinar, so if you would like to read more of the feedback, you can reference back to it when the webinar becomes available. So now I want to talk about the framework that I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar. So this is the formula that is the foundation of the work that capacity building does here at APLA. And it's capacity equals competency times practice. So competency means translating learning into action. And this is done during the role plays in the training, in the 3-day training. And practice is pretty much when housing specialists go back into their office and start applying the skills that they learned from the training. So it's them practicing it over time. Now, research does show that it can take about 3 to 6 weeks to forget what you learned if it's not put into practice. So we really encourage housing specialists during the training to apply some of these things. And we don't tell them, hey, you need to start developing SMART objectives, but we let them know, hey, this is a tool that you can add into your toolbox. And it would be great if you begin to apply it and kind of get used to using SMART objectives or using ORs, right? Open-ended questions, reflective listenings, affirmation, summarizing, right? So we go over a few skills during this workshop. And again, we don't tell participants, you have to do this, but these are tools that you can add, or you've already been doing these things, now you know that they have a name. During the training, we go around and we check in with the pairs to see if they are practicing the skills that we go over with them. And then we also conduct debriefs after they've done the role plays. And in order for us to measure if participants are practicing the skills over time, that's where we do the follow-ups, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the beginning of this year, we did call a few people to see if they've been implementing the skills, but also to see what challenges they've been facing. And so I want to go over some of that data with you. So we can see that 80% of participants feel confident implementing the steps of the housing services model, and over 80% feel confident using the skills they learned from the training. So that's a positive outcome because we can see that they're comfortable applying the steps from the housing services model, but they're also confident in using the skills that we talked about. And again, I tell the housing specialists that a lot of the things that we go over in the training, more than likely they're already doing. And they are. They just now find out that they have a name to it. They know now, like, hey, like, that's what it is. That's what I've been doing. Now, I also want to look at the numbers in terms of the support that housing specialists receive from coworkers, from the organization, and from program partners. We can see that over 70% of participants felt support, either from their coworkers, from the organization, or from the program partners. Now, we do really encourage housing program managers and coordinators to participate in this training because we want them to be able to support their staff in implementing the housing services model, but also implementing the skills from the training, right? Looking back at it, the purpose of this training is to standardize the services in LA County, but looking at it long-term, right, it's looking at our clients, right? We want to make sure that we're providing quality housing services so that our clients can achieve housing stability and self-sufficiency, which will also improve their health outcomes. Now, a lot of housing specialists have mentioned that they have a hard time sometimes finding resources in the community that will cater to their clients' needs. And so I've encouraged housing staff in some of the trainings to really take advantage of the CHIRP meetings because that's an opportunity to network and to meet the presenters that go and talk about the services that they offer from their agencies. And so as decision makers, this is another area in which you can support your staff. And I like talking about any resources or checking in with them to see where they're at in terms of any resources they may need for their clients. I've also had housing specialists ask if I can develop a resource guide for them. But again, because APLA for this training is working with different SPAs, I would not be able to develop that for your staff. And so again, this is where decision makers can come in and possibly, if your agency hasn't already done it, develop a resource guide that housing staff can utilize to reference for their clients. And so these are some of the comments from the follow-up that we received. And this is these highlight an increase in capacity as housing specialists have practiced the skills that they learned since they participated in the training. And again, I won't go over these quotes, but again, this webinar will be posted on the website and you can reference back to it if you would like to read them all. So now I'll get into the planned activities, and I'm sure that this is what all of you have been waiting for. I will be going over the dates for the housing specialist training, the supplemental workshops, and the webinars. I do want to mention that the dates that I'm going over are tentative dates. So they may be subject to change. And if any changes do happen, you all know that I will always announce that to you and let you all know. So I want to start off with the certification training. There will be 3 trainings available for this cycle. This training will be available for new staff, but also for housing specialists who have not yet completed the training. So I know some of you have had staff that have been waiting for this training for quite some time, and so this training will be available to them. So on the bottom, you can see the face-to-face trainings, which are the 3-day in-person trainings. We have the first one that will be taking place October 16th through the 18th of this year. The second one will be January 15th through the 17th. And then the third one will be April 29th through May 1st. Again, these dates are subject to change. If anything does happen, I will let you know. Again, I've already started for the October training, I've already started collecting the letters of agreements. If you do get a new housing person that comes in before October, let me know and I can see if I can add them. But if not, then they would have to wait until the January training. I will be offering an acuity tool training of trainers. Now, last year when we offered this training, it was only available for program managers. However, some of the agencies appointed staff to participate in this training because they also train housing specialists. And so for this year, it will be open to program managers, but also to housing specialists who are comfortable with the acuity tool and also training their team on how to utilize it. So if you do send a housing specialist, please make sure to send someone who feels comfortable with the tool, but also feels comfortable training their team. So I just want to point that out there for those of you who do plan to send housing specialists. This training is scheduled for February 14th of next year. Again, the date is subject to change. And there could be a potential for a second acuity tool trainers TOT if it's needed. So it will be on a needs basis that a second one would be offered. These are the supplemental workshops that will be offered for this cycle. We have the Burnout and Self-Care Workshop, HOPWA Core Competencies, and Managing Challenging Client Behaviors. These were offered last year. However, I only offered one of each. And so I know some staff may have wanted to participate but weren't able to. So for these, please make sure to send someone who didn't participate in the last one. What I will do is I will make sure to send you, when I make the announcement, I'll email each one of you individually and let you know who participated in what training. That way you don't send them again and you give someone else an opportunity to participate. And the reason I chose these workshops again is because I did send out a quick, very short survey to everyone to identify what trainings they felt they needed. And so these were brought up. The HOPWA Core Competencies does have elements of motivational interviewing, and so that's why I selected to also facilitate this workshop again. We just completed the motivational interviewing workshop, which is also available in the housing specialist website. I can send that out again if anyone needs it. And these supplemental workshops are only available for housing specialists who have already completed the certification training. So for those who have not yet done the housing specialist certification training, they will not be able to participate in these workshops. The training dates are below. So we see the Burnout and Self-Care Workshop is tentatively scheduled for November 7th of this year. HOPWA Core Competencies is a 2-day workshop that is tentatively scheduled for March 18th through the 19th of next year. And Managing Challenging Client Behaviors is tentatively scheduled for May 21st of 2020. And last but not least, we have the webinars. I will be offering 2 webinars. We already completed one, which is the MI webinar, but we have 2 other webinars that will be available. The first one that we see here is HIV and aging, which will be going over senior housing. We do know that the aging population is growing, and due to advancements in treatment, many living with HIV or or AIDS are living long and healthy lives. But what we've also seen is that housing can impact the health outcomes of the aging population. And so this webinar is going to discuss strategies that housing specialists can utilize to work with the aging population, as well as what resources are available. That will be tentatively scheduled for April 10th, 2020. And then we also have a trauma-informed care webinar. This topic has been highly requested for quite some time. And so now I want to finally make it available to everyone who's been wanting to have a trauma-informed care workshop or webinar. This is tentatively scheduled for June 22nd, 2020. And the webinars are open to everyone. So they don't have to be certified to be able to participate in this webinar. So that's the difference between the webinars and the supplemental workshops. The supplemental workshops are only for housing specialists who've done the training, the certification training, and the webinars are open for everyone. What questions do you have? I know that I gave you all a lot of information. And what I will ask now is please do not log out, because I am taking roll of who's here. And I want to make sure that I mark everyone who has participated in this webinar. But if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. I am unfamiliar with the Acuity tool. So the Acuity tool is, it helps to determine, or it gives clients a score based on their needs. So let's say, for example, if a client ends up with a score that would be a high acuity, then that would show that the client would need more intense case management. And someone with a mid acuity would be someone who needs a little bit of hand holding. And then we have someone who's low acuity who wouldn't need a lot of hand holding. That you can tell that they're very self-sufficient, they're very independent. The acuity is only specific to HOPWA, and it's very similar to the SPDAT, but a little different. The Acuity tool, if I'm not sure if you have access to Clarity, to the new Clarity system that HCID is using, the Acuity tool is in the system as well. In the past, housing specialists were utilizing an Excel worksheet, which had the domains, and it calculated the score for them. But now everything's moving to Clarity. What I can do, Nika, if you could please send me your email through chat so I can write it down, and I can send you a sample of what they were using before with Excel, because the domains have remained the same in terms of what's now in Clarity. You can, Nika, you can send me your email through private chat. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. On my end, I have already highlighted who is here. So if you don't have any questions, you can log out, and I want to thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You know, you can reach me through email, you can call me as well. But this is where I will end the webinar. Thank you everyone for participating and hearing me talk about the training with all of you. Thank you everyone.